What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we'll be diving into 5 decks that if you're looking to rank up this season for MTG Arena's ladder, playing some standard, I have 5 decks for you that overall have good win rates and also have quick games when you do decide to play these decks. Each of these decks kind of will be in rank of how quick the games are on average to also with an average win rate overall. So just because some decks may be slightly better overall win rate doesn't mean they're always the best option, especially when it comes to ranking, in the sense that especially when you're grinding out matches, you want to try to do them as quickly as possible. With that being said, let's just dive into the decks and let's just talk about them. All right, so the first deck up here that we have on the list is going to be Naya Humans. It comes in at the slowest deck, but it does have one of the higher win rates overall of all the decks going to be shown here today, with it being about a little over 5 minutes of time in order to play a match, as well as about a 58.3% win rate, give or take, in about 78,000 matches since its existence in Arena. Overall, it's a very strong deck because of this relatively quick win rate, quick rate of win, with 5 minutes being the average game length. Also, well-documented stats, being that this deck does produce even as the meta has changed over the course of the last few months. This is definitely a deck that's been kind of a staple of the format overall, in a sense. And the other thing too to note is that the other 2 decks that actually were kind of neck and neck with this one was Mono White Aggro, as well as Is It Mill. Is It Mill I didn't want to put in the list just because it does only have win rate slightly above 50%, even though it has a lot of matches at about the same amount of time. And Mono White, actually, in the various iterations of the deck, has more decks that are over 5.5 minutes than this deck, where it kind of hovers around the 5-minute mark depending on what iteration you are playing. So I did think that this one kind of edged out the Mono White Aggro. But overall, this deck is very solid from bottom to top. It curves very well. It does have a lot of cards in it that definitely help, take advantage against your opponent in that regard. It performs very well even against the top meta decks. I do think one of its better matchups is actually against the Boros Burn. It's not probably the best out there if you're trying to really combat Boros Burn directly, but with it being just slightly underneath 50% overall in win rate, means that it does actually favor itself pretty decently in those matchups, especially depending on whether or not you're on the play and the draw. This deck is definitely one of those decks that can combat pretty well against it. Most of the cards that are in the deck actually are mostly aggro creatures that have secondary effects that try to kind of slow down what your opponent is doing. If you haven't seen this deck, for the most part, a lot of the cards in this deck just have secondary effects that just makes this deck as good as it is, as you don't need to then add additional spells into the deck to kind of make it as make it like have spot removal spells, board wipes, and things like that. Most of the creatures in this deck are what deals the damage to your opponent, as well as removes things on your opponent's side of the board that may get you away from winning. Overall, definitely a good solid win rate choice if this is a deck that you've already have constructed or are close to constructed. This is definitely one of those decks for the next couple months, as standard kind of gets in a flat line as we wait until September for the newest set. This is definitely one of those decks, if you already have it built, might as well stick with it and just continue to grind out the standard ladder, especially if you're trying to rank yourself up to Mythic. Now, this next deck up on the list is kind of a deck that kind of is a little bit on the quicker side because it is playing mostly red. Therefore, when you have access to red cards, you get the haste. That's why Boros Burn is probably as good as it is, because it has a lot of haste creatures as well as ways to do direct damage. But we have Mono Red Aggro. And not to be confused with Goblin Aggro, this is Mono Red Aggro, as most of the cards are just mono red things. There's no tribalism as playing Goblins or anything like that. Playing a wide range of spells, from burn spells to then creature spells, to kind of get the job done. Overall, this comes in at a little bit over 50%, almost 54% win rate at 53.9% in about 25,000 matches that does have on record. Average match is about four and 3/4 or so minutes, a little underneath 5 minutes, which makes it good for ranking because the games will go hopefully quick. For the most part, does a lot of things good. This is definitely a deck that takes advantage of being on the play compared to being on the draw for the most part. Has a solid curve from top to bottom, as it tops out roughly around 5 if you get yourself an Arsonist out. Worst case scenario, most of what you have in the middle of the deck is definitely going to get the job done. A lot of cheap spells here, and a lot of spells that have definitely good advantages to them when they have enter the battlefield effects or attack combat effects as well. Definitely a deck to kind of look out for if you're looking for something that's super aggressive, gets the job done, just hits your opponent as hard as possible, as quick as possible. This is definitely a solid option in that sense. It's strongest matchups are against the slower decks of the format. It does perform a little bit weaker against some of the top decks overall in the top of the meta. That's why it probably sits a little bit more on the lower side of the win rate at 54%. But it does do very well against the more slower to mid-range control decks of the format. So if you do get matched up against that, you'll perform very well there. When it comes to overall win rate, it's definitely something I could see with more playing time and kind of maybe tweaking it here and there depending on what the situation is and kind of what you think may work and what may not work. It's definitely a deck that can compete when it comes to ranking up overall on the ladder with the quick match rate. The next deck up here on the list is going to be Mono Red Goblins. Not to confuse with the last deck, which was Mono Red Aggro. This is just Mono Red Goblins playing around Goblin Tribal for the most part. Overall, this deck is definitely very strong, coming in at about a little over 56% win rate at 56.2% in about 42,000 matches on record. Average match length is a little bit just like the last deck, a little underneath 5 minutes at 4.8 minutes a game. Overall, out of all the decks here on the list, it's probably the most budget friendly, as most of the deck, other than maybe some lands and also, the Goblin Lord, most of the cards in the deck are mostly commons and uncommons, and it's definitely one of those decks that is on the budget side. If it's definitely not a deck you may have if you're a budget player, it's definitely a good deck just because a lot of what the deck does well is that it plays around goblins. A lot of the goblins have haste or give haste, and it tries to get wide on your opponent and deal that damage that way, as well as having spot removal spells to get things out of the way that may otherwise be in the way. Yet again, just like the last matchup, because it does have a higher win rate, it does perform a little bit better against the rest of the meta, as it does do very well against like the runes deck or the enchantments deck, as well as against the slower decks like the control decks and the mid-range decks as well. It does struggle a little bit against the mono whites and the Boros aggro, but for the most part, if you outside of those matchups, it does do pretty decent in that sense. It's definitely a good deck. Yet again, a deck that doesn't cost a lot to invest into if you're looking for a deck to maybe play for the next 3 months until September when rotation happens. This is definitely one of those options. I have talked about this deck, I think, previously here on the channel as being a decent budget option as well for meta ranking or ladder ranking as well. And this is definitely a deck, because of its quick rate, will get you up the ladder at an efficient rate depending on the matchups, but I do think it does have very favorable matchups for the most part. Now, this next deck on the list is in the number 2 slot of this video. It's Selesnya Magecraft, and this is definitely a deck that kind of has popped up a little bit more recently, I think, with some of the new additions of some of the cards from Streets of New Capenna. Overall, this deck does very well in what it's trying to do. It tries to play a bunch of creatures that, get benefits of when you cast non-creature spells and pumps them in that sense. At a 55, a little over 54% at 54.2% win rate, and though it doesn't have the matches played, it does seem to be doing very well over the past few weeks, as it does seem to kind of pop up here on the meta. Sitting at a little bit over 54% is definitely very good in that sense. It does have actually a pretty decent matchup against the Boros Burn decks of the format that I've been running around, because a lot of what we can do is protect our creatures, get them bigger than what your opponent's trying to do, and you can actually probably overwhelm your Boros Burn decks, your aggro decks of the format, because your creatures just get so big that they have to kind of deal with them, or they have to start chump blocking. And typically when you start doing that against those more aggressive aggro decks that are of the format, it definitely stops them from trying to be the aggressor of the match. But yet again, this is definitely a deck that plays a lot of cheap spells, a lot of creatures that just benefit from us playing non-creature spells or copying spells. And essentially, you're trying to pump a bunch of spells and then play like a show of confidence to maybe finish off your opponent by creating additional copies, getting additional Magecraft triggers in that sense. Overall, a very cheap, low-to-the-ground deck, mostly spells in the 1 and 2 mana drop slot. We do have the 1 Legion Angel to get the rest of the Legion Angels from our sideboard. But other than that, most of the cards are yet again on the cheaper side. Just like the Mono Red Goblin deck, this is yet again another deck that isn't super expensive. Really, most of the rares come in the mana base, and there's probably a couple rares in the main deck that you can have. Is the Legion Angel necessary? No. If you don't have those, you can always not have them in the deck. But the Lead9 Light Scribe and the Dragon's Guard Elite are definitely 2 cards that definitely help out this list to kind of help it perform very, very well, alongside of the Clever Luminancer and the Illuminator Virtuoso, which is definitely another new card from Streets of New Capenna that help this deck out very, very good. It also does play Snow Mana, as we do have Blizzard Brawls and things like that to kind of fight your opponent's creatures. But yet again, it's just a deck that tries to beat up your opponent by playing just really big creatures, and it has to make your opponent deal with them in that sense, and plays protection to kind of help them from not get removed from the game. Overall, making it a good deck if you're looking to rank up yet again, just because it does have a quick game time overall. And it does, doesn't cost a lot to invest in if you don't actually have the deck created already. Now, this last deck up on the list is the deck of the meta currently. It is Boros Burn. It is the deck that you see everywhere. If you're not playing it, you're probably playing against it. It's definitely one of those decks that's just kind of steamrolled over the current meta in the most sense. It has a 59% win rate overall, 220,000 matches, and that's saying a lot compared to a lot of the other decks of this list, as it has like almost 4 times even the next deck on the list overall. Average match duration is a little over 4 minutes at 4.3 minutes currently. There are some variations depending on where you look, but for the most part, most of the lists look kind of similar to this. It may be one more of this, one less of that kind of thing. But for the most part, this is the deck that is kind of currently dominating Standard, and this is definitely a reason why you see it a lot. It's a great deck to rank up with, as like I said, it's a little over 4 minutes per match if you definitely get the right draw. It performs very good against most of the meta decks of the format. Really, the only decks that it struggles against are the decks that are built around it, but for the most part, there really isn't a matchup outside of... It looks like, for the most part, based on the tool I'm using, it's like the mono green aggros of the deck, and that's actually a deck that's kind of fallen off just because it is a little bit on the slower side. But this is definitely a deck that just overwhelms the rest of the decks of the format, and for the most part, your opponent has to answer your creatures, or you just take over in that sense, and that's why it's probably the reason why this deck is just so dominant currently in the meta. If you're looking for a deck that's going to get you up the ladder as quickly as possible, this is definitely a great choice. It is a little bit on the costly side, I think, for the most part, as there are some cards like the Luminarch Aspirant, the Bloodthirsty Adversaries, the Brutal Cathars, the Thunder Raijus, for the most part, are definitely cards that are rare and mythic. Also, the Hopeful Initiate. But for the most part, if you invest in some of those cards outside of the Luminarch Aspirant, most of those cards will be around come September, so it's not really wasted currency if you're looking to keep those cards, as I do think there may be another iteration of this deck once rotation happens. The land base gets affected slightly as you lose your pathways and your snarls, but for the most part, the mana base is pretty efficient for what it's trying to do. And yet again, like I said, the deck is performing very, very good, and there hasn't really been a deck that's kind of competing against it for the most part. It just performs very, very well, and that's the reason why everyone's playing it. But with that being said, guys, I know this is a little bit of a different list. It's kind of like a meta list, but it's kind of like a meta list for someone who's looking to rank up in the ladder. And I kind of gave you, the 5 different options. These are some of the options. If you're playing a different option and showing decent success, let me know in the comments below. I always like to hear what you guys are playing when it comes to Magic, if you're playing Arena and whatnot. If you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you want to know when I post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. Until next time, I'll see you in the next video. Just want to give a special shout out to the channel members here on my YouTube channel. You can also become a channel member yourself down below the video, hitting that join button. It definitely helps out a lot, and I just appreciate you guys for your support.